My stepmom married my dad just before he passed, and now she claims she deserves everything he owned. But what she doesn't know about the house changes everything. It's hard to explain how a single decision can ripple through your life, leaving you wondering where things went so wrong. After my mom passed, my dad, Robert, fell into a downward spiral. Her death left a void he couldn't fill, and he started losing control of everything. First, it was the small things, forgetting to pay bills, skipping meals, but soon enough, he lost the house. I couldn't stand to see him like that, broken and alone, so I stepped in. I wasn't in the best financial position myself, but I managed to scrape together enough to buy a modest house for him. It wasn't much, a small two-bedroom place on the outskirts of town, but it was cozy, and I thought it would give him a fresh start. Dad moved in with just a few boxes of his belongings and his dog, Max. That dog was everything to him. Max had been Mom's idea, a golden retriever she brought home years ago to keep Dad company when she was busy. After her death, Max became more than a pet, he was Dad's lifeline. For a while, things seemed stable. Dad spent his days gardening, taking Max on long walks, and trying to rebuild his routine. I'd visit when I could, but between work and my own life, I couldn't be there all the time. That's when Emily came into the picture. She was a widow herself, a charming woman in her late 50s with an easy laugh and a warm demeanor. Dad met her at a community center event, and it wasn't long before she started visiting the house regularly. At first, I was relieved. Emily seemed like a godsend. She'd bring home-cooked meals, sit with Dad in the evenings, and even help spruce up the house. Seeing Dad smile again after months of grief made me believe she was exactly what he needed. They got married a few months later, in a small ceremony in the backyard. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of happiness for him, he deserved to move on and find companionship. But things started to shift after Emily moved in. It wasn't just her anymore. Her two grown daughters, Lisa and Rachel, began showing up more often. At first, it was innocent enough, weekend visits, a family dinner here and there. But slowly, they started staying longer. Before I knew it, they had practically moved in, bringing their own furniture, clothes, and even pets. The small house that once felt like a sanctuary for Dad became crowded and chaotic. Lisa and Rachel were complicated. Lisa, the older one, was a sharp-tongued career woman who seemed to view the house as a place to unwind without any responsibilities. Rachel, on the other hand, was a free-spirited artist with a knack for turning every corner of the house into her personal studio. They didn't just invade the space, they changed it. The cozy living room became cluttered with Lisa's designer throws and Rachel's unfinished canvases. The garden Dad had poured his heart into was uprooted to make space for Rachel's environmental art project. The worst part? Max started retreating into himself. The dog who used to greet me at the door with wagging tails now stayed curled up in Dad's room, avoiding the chaos. Dad tried to keep the peace, but it was clear he was struggling. Emily, who had seemed so kind and nurturing at first, didn't do much to stop her daughters from taking over. If anything, she seemed to encourage it, brushing off my concerns with vague reassurances that they were just adjusting to their new family dynamic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house I had bought for Dad, meant to be his refuge, was slipping away from him. And the worst part? He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't want to admit it. Emily's charm was still there, but it felt performative now, like she was trying to distract us from seeing what was really happening. I'd always thought I'd done the right thing by helping Dad, but watching Lisa and Rachel slowly take over, I started to doubt myself. The home I'd provided was no longer his, and I couldn't help but wonder if Emily's arrival had been a blessing or the beginning of something much darker. The changes in my father's house were gradual but unmistakable. Lisa and Rachel had settled in as if they'd always lived there, their presence growing heavier with each passing week. It was no longer just the small things, the odd rearrangement of furniture, or a few extra items in the fridge. Now, the house had taken on a completely different energy, one that didn't feel like my father's home anymore. Lisa had an air of authority about her, the kind that made it clear she thought she was in charge. She would reorganize the kitchen to suit her preferences, toss out Dad's old but beloved cookware, and replace it with sleek, expensive gadgets. Rachel, meanwhile, had claimed the dining room as her personal studio, leaving half-finished paintings and jars of murky water scattered across the table. The house was no longer a sanctuary for my father, it was their playground. What disturbed me most was how they treated Dad. They didn't just ignore him, they dismissed him entirely. His opinions were brushed aside, his routines disrupted without a second thought. They spoke about him as if he wasn't in the room, making decisions that should have been his without even consulting him. It wasn't outright cruelty, but the indifference was cutting all the same. The breaking point came when Lisa and Rachel turned their attention to Max. They began complaining about him almost immediately, claiming he was too old and unpredictable. They even suggested that he might be dangerous, despite Max being one of the gentlest dogs I'd ever known. Their complaints became demands. Max needed to stay outside, away from the main living areas. Then they pushed further, hinting that Dad should consider rehoming him. Dad tried to resist, but the constant pressure wore him down. I could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his shoulders slumped a little more each time the subject came up. It was clear he couldn't stand up to them on his own, so I stepped in. One evening, after another tense argument about Max, I made a decision. I told Dad I was taking Max home with me. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to protect him from the toxic environment. Max settled into my apartment quickly, but my visits to Dad's house became more strained. Without Max there as his comfort, Dad seemed even more withdrawn. The house was louder now, with Lisa and Rachel's constant bickering filling every corner. The arguments weren't just with Dad anymore, they fought with each other, with Emily, and even with me when I stopped by. The tension was suffocating. Emily's role in all of this was baffling. The woman who had once seemed so caring and attentive and now stood by passively as her daughters overran the house. Occasionally, she'd offer weak attempts at mediation, but it was clear she wasn't willing to push back against them. Her loyalty to her daughters outweighed any concern for my father, and that realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, I kept visiting Dad with Max. The joy on his face when he saw the dog was enough to remind me why I was doing this. Max would wag his tail and nuzzle up to Dad, bringing a brief flicker of light to his weary eyes. But those moments were fleeting, swallowed up by the growing darkness in the house. It was as if the walls themselves were absorbing the conflict, radiating hostility. Dad's spirit was fading, and I didn't know how much more he could take. The house, which I had hoped would be a new beginning for him, had become a battleground. And I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Dad's health began to deteriorate faster than I'd expected. It started with small things, shortness of breath, constant fatigue, and an unshakable cough. Before long, his doctor confirmed the worst, advanced stage lung disease. The prognosis was grim. Hospice care was the next step, and the weight of that reality hit me like a freight train. As much as I tried to focus on being there for him, the situation in the house made it impossible to ignore the storm brewing beneath the surface. Emily and her daughters barely acknowledged Dad's worsening condition. While I sat by his side during doctor visits or helped him sort through his medical paperwork, they continued living as if nothing had changed. Lisa spent her days commandeering the living room with her laptop and phone, barking orders to whoever was on the other end of her calls. Rachel was still holed up in the dining room, churning out her endless art projects. Their complete lack of empathy disgusted me, but I kept quiet, knowing that open confrontation would only make things worse for Dad. It wasn't until I overheard Emily on a phone call that the full picture began to emerge. She was talking to someone about tying up loose ends, and how everything will fall into place soon. The tone of her voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't grief or concern, it was calculation. I couldn't shake the feeling that she and her daughters were just waiting, biding their time until Dad was gone. The thought sickened me, but it also ignited a spark of determination. I couldn't let them exploit him or his home, not after everything he'd been through. I decided to address the issue head-on. During one of my visits, I sat Emily down and tried to broach the subject delicately. I asked her about her plans for the future, about what she intended to do once Dad's condition worsened. Her response was defensive, almost hostile. She accused me of being morbid and suggested I should trust that she had everything under control. That conversation confirmed my worst fears. Emily had no intention of leaving the house, not after Dad's death and certainly not willingly. I'd bought that house to give Dad a fresh start, a place of peace in his final years. The idea that it could end up in the hands of people who treated him like an afterthought made my blood boil. I decided it was time to make things clear. The next day, I returned to the house and asked for a family meeting. It wasn't easy getting Lisa and Rachel to stop what they were doing long enough to join us, but eventually, they begrudgingly gathered in the living room. I took a deep breath and told them the truth: the house was legally mine. I'd purchased it in my name, and while I'd always intended for Dad to live there comfortably, that arrangement didn't extend to anyone else. After Dad passed, they would need to make their own arrangements. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's face went pale, and for the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. Lisa's usual smugness gave way to stunned disbelief, while Rachel's expression twisted into something between anger and panic. It was Rachel who broke the silence, accusing me of being selfish and heartless. Lisa quickly jumped in, claiming I was trying to sabotage their family. Emily, however, remained silent. Her shock soon turned to something colder, more calculating. She stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When she finally spoke, it was with a forced calmness that barely masked her anger. She accused me of blindsiding her, of undermining her relationship with Dad. But her argument fell flat, especially when I reminded her that Dad's well-being was my only priority. I left the house that day with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because I'd finally said what needed to be said. Dread, because I knew this wasn't the end of it. Emily and her daughters weren't the type to back down without a fight. And with Dad's health hanging by a thread, the last thing I wanted was for him to get caught in the crossfire. But I also knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't let them take what wasn't theirs. Dad's passing was a somber moment, one that should have been marked by reflection and the honoring of his memory. But in the days following his funeral, the tension in the house spiraled out of control. Emily wasted no time in making her intentions clear. She began hinting at how much this home meant to her, how she and her daughters had built a life there, and how it would be cruel to force them out. Her approach was a mix of feigned vulnerability and veiled entitlement. She spoke about her grief, trying to frame herself as someone who had lost just as much as I had. But the underlying message was clear: she believed the house should be hers, that she and her daughters deserved to stay. Her pleas didn't sit well with me, not after everything I'd witnessed over the past months. I knew exactly what she and her daughters had been angling for, and I wasn't about to let their manipulation continue. A week after Dad's death, I asked to meet with Emily, Lisa, and Rachel. It was a strained gathering in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken resentment. I laid out the terms plainly and without malice. They had 3 months to either start paying rent or make arrangements to move out. It wasn't about cruelty or revenge, it was about ensuring that Dad's house didn't fall into the hands of people who had only ever seen it as a stepping stone. Emily's reaction was immediate and emotional. She painted herself as the victim, accusing me of being heartless and dismissing her grief. She spoke of how much she and my father had shared in this home, as if that erased the months of neglect and indifference she'd shown him. Lisa and Rachel weren't far behind, their outrage spilling out in sharp, cutting words. Lisa accused me of being cold and calculating, while Rachel went further, calling me a parasite who had no right to interfere. Their arguments were loud and chaotic, but I remained firm. I reminded them that the house was legally mine, that my primary concern had always been my father's well-being, and that they had benefited from my generosity for long enough. My calmness only seemed to infuriate them further. Rachel stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, while Lisa continued to hurl accusations, her words losing coherence as her frustration grew. Emily, however, didn't storm off. She sat there, her face a mask of forced composure, and listened in silence as I reiterated the terms. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice low and measured. She told me that she wouldn't be leaving, that this house was her home now, and that she would fight to keep it. There was no vulnerability in her tone anymore, no pretense of shared grief. It was a declaration of war. The next few weeks were a standoff. Emily and her daughters went about their days as if nothing had changed, but the tension was palpable. They avoided me during my visits, retreating to their rooms or the backyard whenever I arrived. It was clear they were digging in their heels, hoping that I'd back down or give in to their demands. But I knew better than to let their silence fool me. My suspicions were confirmed when I received a notice from Emily's lawyer. She was taking legal action, claiming that as my father's widow, she had a right to the house. Her argument was weak, there was no legal basis for her claim, but it was a move designed to buy time and put pressure on me. I knew this wasn't about justice or fairness, it was about power and control. The house, once a symbol of stability and new beginnings, had become a battlefield. Every room felt like a war zone, every interaction charged with hostility. I could feel the weight of their resentment every time I stepped inside, but I refused to let it break me. This wasn't just about protecting my father's legacy, it was about standing up for what was right. As the court date loomed closer, I prepared myself for the fight ahead. Emily's challenge was a desperate attempt to hold on to a life she'd never truly earned, and I was determined to ensure that justice prevailed. The house had been a gift to my father, a place of peace in his final years. It wasn't something I could allow to be tarnished by greed and manipulation. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter of this battle. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, its sterile walls a stark contrast to the heated emotions coursing through everyone present. Emily and her daughters sat across the aisle, their expressions a mix of defiance and desperation. I'd expected nothing less, they had made it clear they wouldn't go down without a fight. But I came prepared, armed with every document and piece of evidence that would show the truth, that the house was mine and had always been intended for my father's peace. Emily's lawyer attempted to paint a picture of promises and unspoken agreements. They argued that my father had intended for Emily to inherit the house, that it was only fair considering the time she had spent with him. But their arguments were riddled with holes. There were no legal documents, no wills, no written agreements, just vague claims rooted in emotion rather than fact. Their case was built on sand, and it showed. When it was my turn, I presented everything, the deed to the house, the records of purchase in my name, and even emails and texts that documented my discussions with Dad about the property. I explained how I'd bought the house to give him a place to heal after losing my mom, how it was never meant to be a bargaining chip for someone else's gain. My lawyer emphasized the clear-cut legalities, leaving no room for interpretation. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Emily's claims were dismissed, her case deemed baseless. The house, they affirmed, belonged to me, and there was no legal obligation to allow Emily or her daughters to remain. The court gave them 2 weeks to vacate the property. As the verdict was read, I saw the anger flare in Lisa's eyes, the disbelief etched on Rachel's face, and the cold, calculated mask that Emily wore crumble ever so slightly. They had lost, and they knew it. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Emily and her daughters packed up their belongings with an air of bitterness, their resentment palpable in every curt exchange and pointed glance. They made no effort to hide their displeasure, but I didn't care. I'd fought hard to protect what mattered, and I wasn't about to let their anger diminish that victory. When they finally left, the house felt different, lighter, quieter. For the first time in months, it felt like my father's house again. I spent the following days cleaning and restoring it, scrubbing away the physical traces of their presence and reclaiming the space for the memories it was meant to hold. Max followed me from room to room, his tail wagging as if he could sense the change. His presence was a comforting constant, a reminder of the connection I still had to my father. In the quiet moments, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The conflicts, the tension, the battles in court, it had all been exhausting, but it had also been necessary. Protecting the house wasn't just about property, it was about preserving my father's legacy, honoring the love and care he'd poured into his final years. It was about standing up to the toxicity that had threatened to overshadow his memory. Emily and her daughters disappeared from my life as quickly as they had entered it. They left behind no lasting connections, only memories of conflict and a sense of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The experience had tested me in ways I hadn't expected, but it had also strengthened my resolve. I'd learned the importance of boundaries, of standing firm in the face of manipulation, and of protecting what truly mattered. As I sat in the living room one evening, Max curled up at my feet, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The house was quiet, the air no longer charged with tension. It was just me, Max, and the memories of my parents, their presence still felt in the walls and corners of the home they'd loved. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future, about what this house could become now that it was free from conflict. This chapter of my life had been a storm, but it had passed, leaving me stronger and more certain of who I was. Emily and her daughters were a reminder of the challenges that can arise when you try to do the right thing, but they were also a testament to the strength it takes to overcome those challenges. As I moved forward, I carried that strength with me, knowing I'd done right by my father and his memory. And for that, I was grateful.